So welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are today. And we're so pleased to have you with us. We're very excited for this event. My name is Anupama Ranawana, but please feel free to call me Anu. I'll be your chair and techno person for the day for today. Today I have two hats on. My first hat is as the Assistant Secretary for Theology and Race for the Society for the Study of Theology based in the UK. And also I'm a very proud member of the RISC network, where a group of scholars, Indigenous scholars who are researching together, dialoguing together, and journeying together. And it's very exciting. This is our first event held jointly with the Society for the Study of Theology. And in terms of SST, this is very exciting for us because the society has been trying for a very long time to be taking forward an initiative that centers voices that have been historically marginalized in religious studies and in theology. And part of it are events like this one, which bring together voices that you may not often hear, you may not often be assigned to study. So it's very exciting to have this here. Our previous event was Anthony Reddy talking about the theology of James Cone. And today we're very excited to have with us Dr. Randy Woodley with a group of responses from early career Indigenous scholars as well. So I'm going to hand over now to Arvingo and Ratiling, who are going to introduce the event and handle it from here. Over to you guys.
Hi, my name is Arvin. I am from Indonesia. I was born in Indonesia, and then I came to the United States to study science, and then I'm pursuing a PhD in theology. And that's when I encountered Dr. Woodley's work, because when we study the realm of science and theology, there's a lot of movement now trying to understand the Western presuppositions of what we study, both in theology and in science, and how we need a fresh perspective. So Dr. Woodley's book was one of the 5 or 6 books that we selected. And this is part of the critical discourse of science and religion from Lexington Press, that we were looking into this. So we have a series of reviews, very positive review, of course, of Dr. Woodley's book. And that's how I got introduced to this. And I then sent an email to Randy if he was willing to come. And I'm very glad. He doesn't need much introduction, but I can read a brief intro from his book. Yeah. So Randy Woodley is a distinguished professor of faith and culture and director of intercultural and indigenous studies at Portland Seminary. He co-hosts the Piecing It All Together podcast with Bo Sanders and has written several books. Woodley and his wife, Edith, are co-sustainers of Elohe Indigenous Center for Earth Justice and Elohe Farm and Seeds. Welcome, Randy. We're glad to have you here.
Thank you, Arvin. Shall we begin?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm not going to talk much about myself. You can read that. There's a long introduction in the book about a little interview that they did. And first thing I should say is that this book was actually a series of lectures called the Hayward Lectures in Wolfville, Nova Scotia. And I was invited up there to give a series of 3 lectures and an interview. And I think I'm the first Indigenous person invited. I'm pretty sure that's the case. And that was only because an Indigenous person was on the committee that was doing the inviting up there. So, so it pays to be on these committees a little. I gave the lectures. I tried to create, it's a very Western approach. And I tried to create an atmosphere in the lectures that could be dialogical. I don't think, me, talking for hours on end, filling someone with presumed knowledge is an effective way for us to transfer knowledge and experience and learning. So So I try to create more dialogical methodology by using personal experience, by using traditional tribal stories, by having question answer period at the end. And as you see, the book is structured to have me yakking around a bit, and then we have a question answer section each time. And that was the fun part. And so I'm hoping that can be the fun part today as well. I hope people come with questions today, because I'm very much interested in having some dialogue. Basically, my goal of the lectures was to point out some of the failures and fallacies of the Western worldview. So even though the book is entitled Indigenous Theology in the Western Worldview, I always talk about, the reason that the West has a bad theology is because they have a bad worldview. And that worldview is based on about 2,700 years of philosophies that come down from Greek, including Platonic dualism and hierarchies and other things that sort of destroy, or if you will, part reality into different sections. And as soon as we start creating a world where, for example, the ethereal is more important than the material, then we are now living in a false reality. And I would argue that the Western worldview has been living in a false reality for all of this time. It's been embedded in empire since the Greeks and the Romans and the British, and now the Americans. And, it's really baked in the bread, as they say. It's ubiquitous in all of our systems. It's in our educational systems, our economic systems, our political systems, our legal systems, etc. And so to decolonize is the sort of the way out of that. So most of our intention is to decolonize and indigenize along the way. And when I say indigenize, I don't necessarily mean to a North American indigenous worldview. It could be any indigenous worldview, because I think the values are very much the same, or at least similar throughout the world. My project for my PhD was trying to understand the Native American harmony way, which in my language, in Cherokee Kituah, is Elohe, but in various tribes around the United States, it has different names. They all have very similar characteristics and values. And then I began to, as I'm working on my project, began to talk to Maori folk from New Zealand, and Aboriginal folk from Australia, and Zulu from South Africa, and Maasai from Kenya, and Samburu, and Scandinavian Sami, and other people who very much related to these values that came out of this Harmony Way study. And so I began calling them the original instructions, if you will, of how humankind needs to live together. And my connection to Christianity there is using Walter Brueggemann's understanding of shalom, and the big picture idea of shalom is very much akin to really all these other peoples, indigenous peoples around the world's understanding. And so very much began to understand Jesus as a more indigenous person, and understanding his teachings and stories from an indigenous worldview, and in his ancient indigenous system, which I call the Shalom Sabbath Jubilee construct. And that's basically what he came to teach, is a restoration of those values. And so that bucks very much with the Western Christian worldview, which is primarily, we are all sinners, the world is fallen, we must be redeemed, and redeem everything else around us, except that's human. and in our understanding our indigenous ways, and I think also in a very Hebraic sense, everything that has life is made in the image of God. Everything reflects God and God's purpose, and that we are all relatives. And our first duty, if you will, whether it be from my own Ketua stories or whether it be from the Genesis story or stories, is to be people who tend the community of creation, who till the ground, who take care of the earth. That's our first job, to be co-sustainers, if you will. And that tending the community of creation may mean making sure that we have good water, or making sure that we're not losing our topsoil or our coral reefs, etc. But it may also mean that we're dealing with anything where our harmony or our shalom has been broken. So, for example, missing and murdered Indigenous women is a problem here in our North America. Human trafficking, bringing good water supply to places. Wherever we are dealing with harmony, bringing harmony back, putting the world back together as Creator intended, that we are doing our purpose as human beings. That's our job, if you will. That's our main job. And so the Western worldview is very much created theology that has failed at that. Our world is in trouble. I'm sure I don't have to talk about how bad a trouble it's in, but it can be healed, I believe, through an indigenous worldview and an indigenous theology. But we've got to shuck the bad theology, what I call a failed experiment. Western worldview is a failed experiment. And so, of course, to do that, decolonize and indigenize. And that's where I spend a lot of the time in the book. And people have all kinds of questions at the end of each chapter, and they were interesting. And I'm sure people have interesting questions here today as well. And so I'm anxious to get started talking about people's interest.
Thank you so much, Dr. Woodley. That was fantastic. I love the phrase co-sustainers because it moves us to this idea of uncompromising solidarity, I think, in particular. So in that vein, I'm going to bring in the rest of the panel, after which we'll have lots of chance to dialogue together. Our early career panel consists of Elilo Ezung, who comes from the Kyong Naga tribe of Nagaland in the uplands of Northeast India. She's doing a PhD in world Christianity at Edinburgh, and her research area is pneumatology, giving particular attention to Naga tribal theological voices. She's also a postgraduate rep for SST, so also wearing two hats like myself today. We're multiple people. We also have Dr. Elia Maggang, fresh, newly minted Dr. Elia Maggang from Indonesia. And his PhD from the University of Manchester was called A Trinitarian Pneumatology of the Indonesian Maritime. And his research interests revolve around the intersections of Christian theology and indigenous tradition on issues related to the sea creatures, and coastal communities. And last but certainly not least, we have Axolile Qina, finally a PhD candidate in New Testament and Christian origins, also at Edinburgh. Ax's PhD is funded by the Leverhulme Trust, and it focuses on a dilemma concerning animal sacrifice that most Xhosa Christians, himself included, are still faced with nowadays. Looking at this question, if Jesus' perfect sacrificial death on the cross removes human sin once and for all, must Xhosa Christians abandon their own practice of animal sacrifice entirely? So I'm sure this is going to be a really vibrant conversation. So Ellie, I'll bring you in and then we can continue. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you so much for your introduction. Anu, can everybody hear me well? Okay. Thank you for this time, and I really enjoyed reading your book, Professor Randy, your book, Indigenous Theology and Western Worldview, and I think I would like to offer some reflections simply by way of engaging in discussion, perhaps just looking forward to hear some of your thoughts on some of these points. So one of the first thing I noticed, and you mentioned it in the beginning of your book as well, is the undeniable role of Indigenous women, in the nurturing of Indigenous culture, or say broadly Indigenous theology. The presence and recognition of Indigenous women clearly disrupts a narrow vision of what you term the wholeness of life, because their role and contribution as wisdom keepers, partners in preserving Indigenous ways of doing and living, it significantly brings into light what enables Indigenous theology and perhaps theology even more broadly. I think from my personal experience coming from the tribal Naga society of upland Northeast India, I can say that more than anyone else, my mother and my grandmothers have been a constant source of imparting me with Naga Indigenous wisdom and knowledge since childhood. And perhaps I think it would not be too far-fetched to say that among the diverse ways of theologizing, and especially in comparison to historically dominant ways of Western theologizing that has involved mostly written knowledge predominantly associated with men, Indigenous women's contribution in the sustaining and preserving of Indigenous culture and wisdom is so distinct. But without ignoring the challenge of patriarchal elements that are also definitely present in many Indigenous communities globally, it is of crucial importance to recognize this potentiality of women's nurturing of Indigenous meaning making and living. And this aspect of distinct recognition and attribution woven into the very heart of Indigenous theology, I think, may well be a powerful contribution of Indigenous theology, amongst other things. So that's one of the first things I have. And the second, for many Indigenous peoples around the world, no doubt the gospel was heard in a racialized way with colonial and imperial interpretations, which your book also clearly describes. At the same time, the liberative nature of the gospel found a place beyond all these narrow impositions. Hence, Indigenous peoples' response to scripture has been engaging and liberating in meaningful ways as a wrestle to make sense of their struggles, powers that attempted to suppress their very identities, and in their relation with creation and creator in the world. Or in other words, Indigenous people's use of the Bible has been profoundly engaging and liberating for themselves as communities. And these responses have come through both accessibility to the hearing and reading of scripture. So furthermore, taking into consideration attempts by Indigenous peoples today to interpret and translate scripture carefully, textually, incorporating Indigenous wisdom and insights from their local context is itself an expression of indigeneity. So I guess my question is about the value of the text as well, the translating, incorporating Indigenous wisdom and insights. Of course, this does not negate the centrality of the storytelling or orality situated within Indigenous epistemology and pedagogy, where knowledge has been passed on through oral traditions for centuries, sustaining learning, remembering, understanding ourselves, understanding others, and the world, culminating in a reflexive, embodied process that requires persistence and caring. Emphasizing such pedagogies, or in other words, an oral approach to even Bible translation, also draws attention to the potentiality of digital platforms and the heavy dependence on it for human interaction and sharing information globally in today's world. Perhaps Indigenous theology can ask how the digital can engage with oral pedagogies, fostering processes of digital storytelling and narration with intentional modes of interaction can be meaningfully practiced to foster creative ways of thinking and doing Indigenous theology. And such attempts, of course, must be wary of the challenge of physically and spiritually becoming disconnected with creation, the land, the trees, the rivers, the seas. Third, one of the critical role of Indigenous theology is no doubt, as you point out, the normalizing of reparations, and rightly so. Simultaneously, reparations also provoke complex questions regarding the nature of reparation itself towards human beings and also towards creation. For instance, how does the reparations of forest, air, rivers look like? Are reparations to be carried out in a context of partial, half-hearted apologies? Because it may be possible for reparations to simply become a tool to shield past colonial oppression in histories. But reparations, of course, cannot cancel colonial histories, or for that matter, any history. How may Indigenous theology continue to navigate these crucial questions around reparations, lest they become all too normal, all too easy to perform? And finally, I would like to just hear your thoughts also about the use of the Indigenous theology as an umbrella term. Does it potentially pose itself as a homogeneous term that may risk recognizing the cultural diversity within Indigenous peoples? Responding to misconceptions that Indigenous peoples are a homogeneous group who share the same culture, needs, and desires seems to be a humongous task ahead, because little could be further from the truth. Furthermore, if Indigenous theology can be understood as part of the process of decolonization, challenging dominant ways of knowing and offering alternate ways of doing, does it continue to carry, in some sense, the coloniality or colonialism, categorizing a wildly diverse array of people around the world within a single identity, particularly one born of ideology of social evolutionism, which has been crafted in white settler state and burdened with colonialist baggage, particularly demands a critical lens from every possible angle. So these are some of the thoughts I have, and we would love to hear your thoughts on some of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eli. Dr. Woodley, did you want to respond right away, or should I bring in the rest of the panel? Or
let's just do one at a time here because there's
Right.
a whole lot there. So yeah, thank you for your thoughts. That was those were some deep questions and some concerns. So I'm just going to kind of take them from the bottom where you ended and go back up if I can. And of course, I am only responding from my own experience and my own knowledge. I'm not speaking for anyone else. These are just my opinions. And so I appreciate you asking these things. So let's start with this idea of shared values. That people, tend to think, oh, are all Indigenous people the same, that kind of a thing. And I think we, in terms of epistemologies, the book that I wrote after the book that we're talking about today, called Mission and the Cultural Other, A Closer Look, really deals with a lot more deeper, specific theological things like epistemologies, Trinity, scripture, all of those kinds of things. So that's a little bit deeper dive. This was, like I said, it was a lecture mostly to throw out the things that I'm most concerned about with the difference between the Indigenous and Western worldview. I, of course, can't speak for any more than what I researched, and that were 45 tribes in the United States and Canada who all shared common values, very different traditions, very different religions, very different experiences, all of that sort of a thing, because there's only 4 ways that I think that we kind of come to know things, and really 3, but because we're in a Christian context, I'll say 4. So the first would just be from the land, the earth. Our theology, really everyone's theology, begins with the earth, but particularly Indigenous people hold on to that, and Western people sort of discard that. But the earth is our foremost teacher, our longest lasting teacher, and our deepest teacher. And Creator has placed us on this earth to learn from the earth. And so that is what we all have as Indigenous people in common. When we lose contact with our relationship with the earth, we begin to lose our indigeneity. To me, Indigenous theology always begins with the earth and our relationship to the earth. And so the second way of knowing would be through our communities. We're taught in our different communities, and this is where the diversity comes in, I think, is so much as that we all have different objects, we all have different images, we have different stories, we have different songs, all of those things, but many, which I mentioned earlier, reinforce those values, right? The religion can come out in many different ways, but the values, I think, are what we have often in common. At least those of us in North America, and I'm sure other folks around the world as well. So our community, of course, there is our own conscience, which is another sort of thing that we have as free people to understand and reject those community stories or anything else that we want, to accept or reject them. Our own conscience will allow us to sort of chart our individual paths. And then finally, we have scripture, which is a book, 90% story. Most people don't realize that the Christian scriptures are mostly story. And so if we don't understand story, we have a whole lot of problems. And I would argue that the West really doesn't understand story in the way that the writers wanted story expressed. No one who wrote anything in scripture expected it to be interpreted and sliced and diced in the way that the Western world has done. And so I always, I talk to both conservative people and progressive people here in our country, and I tell them both, if you're asking the question, did this happen? Did this not happen? Conservatives are trying to prove something in scripture happened. Progressives are trying to prove it didn't happen that way, but there's another explanation. And I just say, I think you're both asking the wrong questions. The right question is, what's the truth in the story? Not, is the story fact or truth? And so understanding those is my sort of 4 epistemological assumptions. And like I said, really 3, because scripture would go into our community or traditions. I don't know, maybe there's other ways of us understanding things besides that, but that's, but the important thing is, I think, is to look at those values in that first thing that I mentioned, which is the understanding the land. And so if we understand, yes, we all have similarities, but we're all different, right? If we focus on just the difference, we're not going to get very far. But if we focus on the similarities with the differences, this is what I call unity and diversity, which was the subject of my first book I wrote, was trying to understand God's passion for diversity. Next, the next to the last thing you mentioned were reparations and understanding those. And I have a whole teaching that I do on reparations, but basically it's a process that we go through. There's no formula. I think it has to be done at a more local level. I don't know that that there can be, there might be some form of national reparations, but that's certainly not going to create healing, I don't think. And so there has to be local Indigenous guides who guide people on local land through a process, and public confession and lamentation. So in other words, speaking truth to power. There has to be reparations. And in those reparations, I talk about the fact that while the Western world largely views that as a zero-sum game, it's, we give something to you. And what the picture they're missing is this idea that, no, when they give up what's most important to them, which often is material things, right? And again, there's no formula. I mean, it may be monetary, it may be something land, it may be something different. But that hopefully that process led them to the right place. that this is what is their salvation. This is what is their healing, is that when they are able to give up something meaningful for a wrong that's been done, it's not just for the indigenous people, it's for their own healing. And then the final act of what I would call the reparation cycle would be memorializing that. So it's a public public display so that people can say, oh, we're actually dealing with these problems. And then they take it from there. The value of the text, I think I've talked about story to talk about that. How our indigenous people around the world have understood the gospel as liberative. I think it's, as at least in the North American experience, we were open to dialogue. There's not as I like to say, before 1492, there was never a war about religion in America. And so very tolerant of other beliefs and systems and allowing people to believe. And so I think it was largely accepted. For example, I lived among the Kiowa people for a good while, and an elder told a story, and he said, you know, when the Christians first came to us, we were open to it, and they had their problems. They told us we needed to cut our hair, we needed to dress in white man clothes, we needed to sing English hymns, but none of that mattered because that was we knew who we were as indigenous people. But as the second and third generation came along, they began to see those markers of cut hair, English hymns, white man's uniforms, all of those as the markers of what it meant to be Christian. And of course, the missionaries helped that process along by condemning everything native or indigenous, and called them evil, of the devil, et cetera, et cetera. So I think understanding sort of the process and the bad theology that went along with it would maybe tell us that it's not as liberative as we think, or at least it could be more liberative if we apply our own indigenous ideas. Finally, yes, indigenous women, very important. I think my wife's in the other room listening to this, so I'm going to make sure I emphasize this. Yeah, a lot of our societies, including my own people, were matrilineal, somewhat matriarchal, and those tribes tended to fight less, to have better systems of check in place, and lots of wisdom. I think the English, when they came here and started trying to deal with my people, they made some comments about how every person in the village, man, woman, and child, had a say about any issues. And they would say they take 3 or 4 days just to talk about, make it the simplest decision, right? Because there was no hierarchy. There was contributive people in contributive spaces, but everyone actually had a say. And one of the things they dubbed the Cherokee government is they called us the petticoat government, because we allowed our women to speak. When more it was like the women allowed us to speak, I think would be a better way of looking at it. There are certain functions that women had and certain functions that men had. Sometimes those are confusing to people in a more modern setting because, the idea is that, well, women can do anything men can do. And we had that system too, it's just more rare. But for a tribe to function, everybody sort of had to understand what their work was. And I've certainly, been in Native American gatherings when I've walked into a women's domain and they've quickly chased me out of the room because they have their own domain. In a lot of our tribes here, women are inherently considered sacred because, and that's our traditional value. We're losing those to more colonial presence, but because they can create just like the earth, and so they're considered sacred. Children are considered sacred because they came from this place of great mystery. Elders are considered sacred because they're going there and they've gained wisdom throughout the year. And in a lot of, especially Plains Native societies, it was men who had to actually prove their worth. Everybody else had inherent worth. Men had to either learn how to be great hunters and share, generous people, make wise decisions so they could be on councils, become a part of a warrior society so they could protect the people. But they had to basically prove themselves. And so I think there's a lot of indigenous patterns of indigenous women that the West has to learn. And I'm pretty sure the world would be in a lot better shape now if we were operating that way. So, thank you. I know I didn't address everything deeply, but I tried to hit all your points. There's a lot of good stuff there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Woodley, and thank you, Ellie, for the great start. From I guess the realization of the land, but also to the sea, I bring you in now, Dr. Elia.
Thank you very much, madam. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah. Responding to Dr. Woodley's talk on Indigenous theology is an honor for me, and I specifically engaged with Dr. Woodley's thoughts on his book, The Indigenous Theology and the Western Worldview, which have helped us to understand the differences between the Indigenous worldview and the Western worldview. Indigenous is holistic, while the Western is individualistic and dualistic. The book also offers Christians some fundamental perspectives to deal with those differences. One of the perspectives is the notion of shalom. Dr. Wood had already talked about it, which speaks of the indigenous worldview and its expression in harmonious life. Shalom also speaks of the restoration of the relationships broken by the Western worldview, including the liberation of the oppressed and marginalized. But I want to engage more profoundly with Dr. Woodley's talk, which begin with the land, on ecological issues from my coastal indigeneity, which begins with the sea. This engagement will display a sort of complexity because the age of the sea influences the coastal ages, making the land fluid to alter into unpredictable shapes. The tidal movement of the sea implies that the age of the sea always takes from and adds something to the land. As a native Oceania, Gione Hafea says, no one can return to the original island like the tide, which from dead calm seas to angry tsunamis never return to the same spot twice. There is no original point and end of encountering the sea, but new possibilities emerging from the edge of the sea. But I believe this complexity will enrich our conversation and indigenous theological discourses in the future, making indigenous theology more planetary, if you like. Dr. Woodley's thoughts on indigenous worldview are vital to addressing the ecological crisis. As expressed in its culture, an indigenous holistic worldview helps us to live in harmony or shalom with non-human creatures. In that regard, we need to embrace the indigenous culture, although that culture is not always correct. As Dr. Woodley succinctly asserts, our indigenous cultures have been here for tens of thousands of years, and there have been lots of times when we didn't get it right. But we've been learning on this continent longer than anyone else. So I think we've gotten more correct and more often, and so have more wisdom to share, unquote. This assertions is local and land-based, but because it derives from indigenous people's interactions with their particular environment, it could also apply to the coastal community whose indigeneity is navigated by their interaction with the sea. In Indonesia, for instance, many coastal indigenous practices play a significant role in the conservation of the sea. A few indigenous Christian communities embrace the traditional practices and perform the ritual of those practices. In some of those communities, the indigenous culture becomes an interfaith practice. For example, Muslims and Christians in Pantar Island, where I come from, work together to perform the ritual and practice of mulung, a a tradition that prohibits any fishing activity in a particular area for a period of time. This indigenous tradition aims to let the sea and sea creatures recover from damages caused by fishing activities and create a space for sea creatures to flourish. Now the Indonesian government has begun to listen to coastal indigenous people and embrace their cultures, although just in some ways. Another concern of Dr. Woodley that fundamentally affects the ecological discourse is the Western Worldview, domination. The Green, which speaks of the Eurocentric land-based and colonial imaginings, as Whitney Bowen says, dominates theological discourses on ecology and the environment. That domination is dangerous to the sea and coastal indigenous community because it hinders Christian theology from the ecological crisis at sea, as Richard Bauckham acknowledges. I believe Dr. Woodley will reject that domination because that is contradicted to the indigenous worldview, which is anti-domination. However, we must be critical in our conversation on indigenous theology in the context of ecological crisis. The Green Movement might, in some ways, go hand in hand with indigenous culture because of its embrace of indigenous worldview on the land, for instance. That might make us complacent. There is no doubt that indigenous green Christianity can create a harmonious life on land, but that would not work for the harmony of our planet, which consists of prismatic communities symbolized with diverse colors. The sea and its interconnection with other natural elements and coastal people, symbolized by the blue, have been overlooked and characterized negatively in Christianity, influenced by the Western worldview. That ignorance has negative consequences on the sea. That domination of the land-based Western worldview has been destructive to coastal communities in the Caribbean, as Michael J. Geisers argues, and in Indonesia as well. Thus, the challenge, in my view, is how the indigenous worldview and its practice in one community positively impacts other indigenous communities. Will we allow, and in what ways, the sea to take from and add something to the land in our indigenous theological discourse to create a planetary harmony of shalom? Thank you.
Thank you, Elia. Please, Dr. Woodley.
Yes, that's a wonderful reminder to me to constantly be conscious of something that I'm not that familiar with. My experience with the sea is limited, but I try to learn from it each time I visit the oceans. And I do learn something every time. It's a very calming place for me. So I can't, you have much more to offer than I would about that. But I just want to make a couple comments. I have a very close Hawaiian friend, and he talks about Aina, the land, and that the sea is just part of the land. So it's an extension. So when we talk about the land, we also have to be talking about the sea. And I like the idea of making this a more global theology physically. That's a wonderful image for me to understand. The people of the sea are experts in their area, just like other indigenous peoples are experts in their areas of maintaining, we call them keepers. So like there are certain keepers of certain medicines. They're keepers of the animals. They're keepers of the birds. There's keepers who keep an eye on what is happening and what we need to do. Because as you said, as you remarked, these things didn't just come automatically. We had to learn these things over thousands and thousands of years. And so to ignore our sea peoples, to ignore their knowledge is to do that at our own peril. And I'm so happy that your community is cooperating with other people to do this. When it comes to the earth, we all have that in common. And so to be able to bridge those gaps is something that we must do petty things like religion and our beliefs shouldn't stop us from the most important things, which is to sustain our future generations. And so I think we all have that in common. I'm beyond that. I would just say, I could listen to you talk about this for a lot longer than I have anything to say about it. And I'm really happy that you brought this up, because it's something that I should emphasize more when I talk, that we have to understand the sea and the keepers of the sea. So thank you. And hopefully I'll be able to, you've been doing in a book someday soon. So.
Fabulous. It's amazing to think in terms of the global, of the planetary, in that way, and seeing this conversation it's brilliant, I think. I'll now shift to Ax. Please come in, Ax.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me. I'm gonna just share my the challenges of Indigenous theology in South Africa. And I have some questions for Professor Woodley at the end. So I'll just read my paper so long. So the Rhodes Must Fall movement that started at the University of Cape Town on March 12th, 2015, called for decolonization of South Africa's education and racial transformation in universities. Similarly, at Stellenbosch University, where I was studying for my master's at the time, the student-led activist group called Open Stellenbosch launched its campaign to challenge the role of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction at the university. Having completed a bachelor's degree with honors at this institution in 2014, I shared the movement's sentiments, especially since during my undergrad studies, there were some lectures and tutorials conducted in Afrikaans with little or no English. On November 12th, however, 2015, the Stellenbosch's Rector's management team recommended that the university's lingua franca be changed to English in accordance to the demands of Open Stellenbosch. This was then ratified as a new language policy in June 2016 by the University Council. This might be deja vu for those who are familiar with the Soweto uprising in apartheid South Africa in the 16th to the 18th of June 1976, where this was a Black-led protest of about 20,000 high school students that opposed the apartheid government's decree of making Afrikaans the medium of instruction in their schools. Such an action prohibited access to education through a foreign language not of their own. Thus, this request for changing the lingua franca to English was not something new in Stellenbosch, though it was situated in a historically Afrikaans university. However, this language policy that rectifies went beyond just changing it to English. It also added a further clause that aimed to incorporate isiXhosa as a language of instruction by 2030. This attempt was keeping in accordance with what was being done in high schools in South Africa today, where my mother, who just retired as a high school teacher in Soweto, often explained to me that students can now learn any of the 11 official languages of the country as a second language, with English being the first. Although in my high school, I did shift from learning Afrikaans as a second language to isiZulu, this has been an invaluable shift actually for my PhD here at Edinburgh, where I've had the privilege of reading and translating Xhosa written literature. Unknown to me until I started my PhD, Lovedale Mission Press, which was founded by the Glasgow Missionary Society, had its own Xhosa newspaper called Isikidima Sama Xhosa already in the 1800s. Articles in these newspapers exposed the rich history and knowledge that was reinscribed from oral traditions to written work by Xhosas. Lovedale Mission Press collection is now housed at Rhodes University in the Eastern Cape, South Africa. Sadly, though, the Mission Press is still requesting funds, since workers there volunteer freely without pay, and it has become difficult to sustain themselves, especially since they receive no financial support. It is one thing for institutions to change language policies so students have access to education, further allowing them to learn in their own Indigenous languages. However, this access should not inhibit preservation and upkeep of invaluable Indigenous knowledge. This history must be safeguarded for future generations, where organizations like Lovedale are financially supported. and history is made available to all, not just to researchers. So this is a question of access. That's one question I would like to ask. What do you think about how do we ensure access of indigenous knowledge to sort of trump the bad Western worldview or bad theology, as you say, Professor Woodley? That's probably the first question I would curiously want to hear from you there. So just to provide an example then of why this is important, the small Eastern Cape town of in South Africa called Grahamstown recently wanted to change its name to Makhanda. It was quite shocking to see on media and in the public, people didn't know who Makhanda was. A professor had to be invited on the news to actually find out who this figure was. But Makhanda was a Xhosa prophet, and he's also known as Ngele, and he attacked Grahamstown during the Fifth Frontier Wars between the British Cape Colony and Xhosas in the 1818 to 1819. He justified his military campaign theologically, claiming that this new god for the blacks called Ndalipu would come and help and make the British bullets turn into water. This newly created god was different to the god of the whites, who was called Titlo. Ironically, though, Titlo was the name used to refer to the Christian god, which was first introduced through the Ngweba, which is a mixed ethnic group of Khoi and Xhosa people who were interpreters for the Western missionary Dr. Johannes van der Kemp in 1799. So in this distinction between gods, Makhanda was able to convince the Xhosa chiefs to attack Grahamstown, but they were unfortunately defeated, resulting in the prophet being arrested after handing himself in and then being imprisoned in Robben Island in August 1819. A year later, he attempted to escape with a small party on a boat, but it capsized and he died at sea. Since his body was never found, this led to a very strong belief that he would return, giving rise to a proverb that said, Kukuza kuka Ngele. It is the coming of Ngele. So Ngele's indigenous theology is bound to Xhosa creational myths. So for example, he told Xhosas that he was sent by the great spirit of Uhlanga to avenge their wrongs and had the power to call upon from the grave the spirits of their ancestors to assist them in the battle against the English, which in Xhosa is Amanglesi. And Uhlanga can be translated as like reeds or hole or cave. And it is both the physical location from which all created things originate and also the very source of creation itself, that is the Xhosa creator God. So in these periods, if there was a drought, war, famine, epidemic, and even epidemic of humans and cattle, prayers would be offered to this creator God. And if unsuccessful, then animal sacrifices would be made to ancestors. Ancestors were and continue to be mediators between humans and God. Though Ngele reincorporates Xhosa creational beliefs, his agenda operates in an indigenous theology that depends on spiritual entities to deliver the Xhosas from the impending colonial threat. Negative events among the Xhosas like poor health, bad luck, are all often attributed to humans possibly having offended their ancestors or required to find out the reasons for these unsuccessful occurrences by consulting priest diviners. Therefore, in a South African context, it is not enough to just change a language policy. Although it is a starting point, I think that preserving of indigenous history should be accessible to all and not just be limited to the educated class. So again, to add to access, how do we make access available to all and not just the educated elite, or those who have the privilege of studying further, like many of us in this Zoom call? So exposure of important indigenous figures like Makhanda and literature written in indigenous languages of South Africa at high school can also allow people in South Africa to be aware of their own history, informing themselves of the complexity of their country's past, and developing new indigenous theologies for the needs and concerns of today. Only then can we start decolonizing the country's education and transforming university institutions. My questions then is, how do you think, Prof. Woodley, that policies can be effective in decolonizing education in school? and what role do they have, and how effective can they be, especially in ensuring access? How can education also, education, just to maybe some context with people in the room, education in South Africa is synonymous with colonization and the missionaries' project of civilizing the native. Even what I'm saying could also, when we talk about education, is also a problem there. So what's your take on indigenous languages being a medium of instruction instead of the languages of empire, which in the South African case would be both English and Afrikaans? And then in what manner can indigenous theology transform and reinscribe the history of previously colonized indigenous peoples, which in the South African context is quite important because of the way education is being treated by, I might get into trouble for saying this, but it's getting treated by the ANC government, where children are being pushed to pass with no rigorous focus on preserving history. In high school, we learned about the Holocaust. I'm not saying the Holocaust is something we should learn about, but I only found out about Elia and Maggang in my PhD. Why must I study a PhD to know my own history? So there's something there about access and class and privilege that I think in a South African context, it's actually a problem. It's problematic. And how do we fix that? How do you think we can practically fix that as researchers? Because here I am in Edinburgh, I'm at the Zoom call, and fortunately it was free, but people who live in the township maybe need to know about Ndlele and they don't have a smartphone. And so how do we make stuff like that accessible? So yeah, thank you. That was my reflection. I hope it was fine.
Thank you, Ax. Dr. Woodley, please.
Yes, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that history lesson and those questions. We have a saying here. It's like, this is the question where the rubber hits the road. This is like where reality is, right? So I'm going to share with you a little bit of my experience. Our goal, I'm probably the most reluctant PhD you've ever met. I come from very poor means. Both of my parents from extremely poverty, and education was not considered important at all. I took 9 years to get my bachelor's degree. I didn't want to do a master's degree, but I ended up, because I felt a call to ministry, I had to get an MDiv. And then after that, I had the vision to create this place, this Elia, a place of community learning, our traditions and cultures, and a school. And so our idea of teaching is to sit around a fire, and we all sit in a circle around the fire and we talk together for hours. And that's what my pedagogy, if you will, or anthrogogy, that's what it is. We established a place like that, 50 acres in Kentucky. And eventually we were chased out by a white supremacist group, white nationalists with a 50 caliber machine gun, and we couldn't get any help from anywhere. And so we lost that place. At that point, it was a very successful farm. Oh, we had cattle, sheep, goats, chickens, we had gardens and orchards we'd planted. We had a community living there. We had elders who came and lived there at different times and sort of oversaw things. So especially when we had our schools, and we were actually living the vision, living out the dream there. And so we lost all that. And I was also working on my PhD at the same time. Now, I didn't want to do a PhD. My wife and I traveled around the United States and Canada for 4 years with our kids, and basically mentored a number of indigenous people on reservations and reserves throughout the country, and then did a lot of speaking at places and sometimes Christian colleges and seminaries would invite us to speak. And so at one of those, after being there a week, and I'd invited two of my Indigenous friends, Terry LeBlanc and Ray Aldred, also to be there, we were asked by the faculty to meet with them at the very end, and they said, you know, we want to help you. We want to figure out a way that we can empower you. And what would you like us to do? And my response, I was the first one to respond, and I said, well, since you're on our stolen land, you should like cut out 5 acres and give us the proceeds from it and let us start our school, which is what we're trying to do to empower Indigenous people. And they considered that actually, but couldn't do that. And but they said, we can offer you scholarships to a PhD program. And I said, no, thank you. I'm not interested in a PhD. I'm interested in, you know, a place where we can teach our harmony way and decolonizing and indigenizing. Well, so I gave that up. One of us took that offer. The second year they asked in front of my wife, and I said, no, thank you. I'm not interested. Again, I was asked to come back and speak, and they said, well, what if we helped you find a property where you could start your program and we gave you some money towards it? And so they offered to give us $10,000 a year for 3 years to help pay for the land. So, and I still said no. And then my wife said, you know, don't say no so fast. And she said it in front of the person, you know, and I said, well, I'm not interested in a PhD. And she said, you know, if you do this, you will have access to places that most of our people will never have access to. And you'll be able to speak to power in those places in a way that that we couldn't, because they won't invite you if you don't have those 3 letters after your name. And so we decided to go ahead. Several of us did it. Richard Twiss, my good friend, and I decided to start together. And the 4 of us kind of went through a program together as an unofficial cohort, if you will, and encourage one another. But I remember in the first week, we quit 5 times. We said, you know, we learned the word hegemony. We didn't know that word before we got there, but we found out what hegemony and hegemony is. So we just kept saying in the first week of school, this is hegemonic bullshit. We're not interested in what they have to say. Well, we ended up sticking it out together, largely making them teach to where we are. So for example, we would take courses where there were only white authors, and we would say, no, this is not acceptable. And so they would allow us to use other books, you know, and we challenged them the whole way. And so it was a learning experience for them as well. Fortunately, I was in a place where they were amenable to that. So it was a school of intercultural studies. So so I ended up with that, and you know, it's been absolutely true. I've been invited places like this, for example, that I would never be invited if I hadn't, you know, gotten a PhD and maybe written some of these books. At the same time, it's a struggle. It's a balancing act, if you will. You're walking a tightrope between the Western world and a more indigenous world. And the Western world is for us, full of injustice. And so how much do you rely on that side? And then how much do you bring your own indigeneity to it? And that's the largest struggle that I encountered the whole time I was teaching, the last 15 years, which I only took a job as a professor because I had a PhD and I didn't know what else to do, maybe work at McDonald's. But so I decided, well, I guess I'm going to teach. I've been teaching all along, and we'll see what it's like teaching in academia on a full-time basis. And so I was only hired half-time as an adjunct professor for 2 years, and then 3/4 time. And then finally, I got in as a full-time professor. And so I had 15 years doing this, which was a great learning experience. One, learning that most of the students that were coming to the seminary where I was teaching, Portland Seminary, were coming for existential reasons. They weren't coming necessarily to be pastors or to be denominational ministers or whatever. They were coming because they were trying to figure out, how do I leave this current Western church and still hang on to God? And so that was the joy of it. But I was also in all the Christian institutions I was in were extremely racist. Not just microaggressions, but also systemically. And so I had to challenge some of those. I was actually fired from one of those because I caused too much trouble, and what we call good trouble around these parts. But I look back on my 15 years at the Portland Seminary, and I see that I made it. I did change things, and I'm not going to get into all those, but I was able through the system to create, and bucking the system enough to create space for that. Now, your whole point is like, how do we make this accessible to the people? There's something that I hate about decolonization studies, and that is that it's written in such a language that you have to at least have a PhD in order to understand it and learn the language and understand. That is not a theology from below, which a decolonizing theology should be one from below. And so how I've tried to do that is write books at a level that could be respected scholarly. So I have footnotes and things like this, but try to write in the language of the people. Now, I'll tell you honestly, after 15 years in the academy, it's very difficult to do. You know, I always tell my wife, I'm trying to brush off the stink of the academy, you know, when I talk to people, but to real people, right? Where people really are. But I've written some children's books that deal with the same message. I've written some more popular books. I've written a meditational book that's called Becoming Rooted, 100 Days of Reconnecting with Sacred Earth. That's written not to Christians particularly, but just spiritual people who want to reconnect with the earth. So I'm trying to do this from all angles. And now that I've worked my way out of academia, here we are back on our farm. We're starting to have our schools again, and sitting around a fire and teaching. And so it was a long journey to get here. And I had to, yes, compromise along the way in various places. And sometimes I was too young and too impetuous to wait it out, and so would force their hand to like fire me or whatever, you know. But in the long run, the journey was worth it. I'm glad I took it, but we always have to keep in the front of our minds the fact that we're doing this for the people. And so how do I, in my society, and really, you know, that's something you have to figure out for South Africa, but how do I do that in my communities and in my society, begin not to just change myself and be a model of that change, to create models that people, because I used to think, oh, the bigger platform I had, the more impact I could have, right? But I really don't believe that anymore. I believe that if you create a good model and invite people to see that model, they will be inspired to take that back to their communities and use what they saw good out of it and change. So I'm always challenging. And so now we have constantly are being asked by Western Worldview folks, white folks mostly, but you don't have to be white to have a Western Worldview, of course, but to tell the story, to listen, that they want to listen to what they have to say. And then I'm always very, very cognizant to say, you have to do something about this. You can't just hear this. You can't continue the dualism. You have to actually take action. And like in my book, Becoming Rooted, after every meditation, there's an action point, so that to break up that dualism. So you'll have to find creative ways to do it. I have this model that I've been trying to live with for about the last 20 years, and I call it me, my world, and the world. And so this happens, you know, this, a lot of times I'll use this in an ecological sense, you know, what am I doing ecologically? What am I doing in myself and my family? And then what am I doing in my community? Am I trying to stand up for earth rights in my community? Am I trying to do something significant in my own, whether it's my community, civic community, or my school, or my church, or my organization, or whatever it is? I always think it's a bit hypocritical for us to go out and try and save the world when we can't deal with our own communities, right? So this is my world. What am I doing in my world to make change? And then if we have integrity in both of those areas, I think then we may get the opportunity, not many of us do, but we may get the opportunity to change the world. And so we have to be creative. We have to be collaborative. We have to realize that when we are teaching pedagogy, if you want to dismantle the Western worldview, you can do it through pedagogy. It's not necessarily as much what we teach, but how we teach it. If it's a democratized view of learning, then it's going to break down those walls of hierarchy and everything else, and we will begin to see the importance of all the people around us. So yes, I'm very encouraged by what you all are doing, and I look forward to seeing the creative ways that you can express that in your own communities and hopefully the world. So that's just sharing my own experience. So.
Thank you, Dr. Woodley. That challenge to us to be creative, and it's not, like on pedagogy, which is I think so important for us to take forward. Not how you teach and what you teach, and having those questions first and foremost. So in the spirit of that, we now have some time for an open discussion. So if you have a comment or a question you'd like to raise, you can either raise your hand or put it into the chat, whatever you feel comfortable with doing. So please, the space is open and not structured at all, actually. So please go ahead. Thank you, Andrew. Yes, Priyanka, please come in.
Thank you for this wonderful session and this reflection. My question is, it's a relational question, and based on my own lived experience of Indigenous people from central India, that's like Adivasi. So my question is that when Western Christian worldview is very much different from Indigenous worldview, and that worldview means Western worldview is unethical and unjust. So similarly, since my childhood, what I have experienced, and then my grandmother and mother have experienced, is the other kind of I would say like two more kinds of worldviews. One is Brahminical Hindu Brahminical worldview, and then Western Christian worldview. So in that sense, when me as a person who wants to do something in her community, she wants to decolonize and de-Brahmanize these worldviews and want to give to at least to my generation that worldview, which is, I would say, like almost untouched by these two dominating worldviews. So in that sense, like how we can theorize that when we have like so much complexity and diversity in the context of Indigenous theology in transnational context, or I would say like globally. So I would like to have a response from like anyone. Thank you.
Please, Dr. Woodley.
Yeah, I'll respond, but of course, anyone else is free to as well. It's, yeah, the challenges before us are overwhelming. And the dominance of a colonial worldview is, just keeps marching on and keeps, enveloping more and more areas and things like this. And so, but I'm also encouraged in that as more Indigenous people and other people of color from different experiences move into places of importance, at least in that system, that they will be able to affect change. We are, that's my own story personally. It wasn't my goal, but while I was in the system out of necessity, I needed a job, and I was a teacher and I had a PhD. And so how do you make a living now after losing everything? But I realized that I can actually make change in that system. We have in our United States government, for the first time, an Indigenous cabinet member. And she's making great changes in the areas of her responsibility on the president's cabinet. So I think things are changing. We just, it's sort of like the glass half full, glass half empty kind of a thing. We're used to being beaten down and treated unjustly for so long that we think things will never change. But there is a lot of good happening, and there are a lot of more people with different views, different understandings, and more just worldviews who are gaining power. And so it's not hard for people to see the right thing when you remove the propaganda. So once you begin to demythologize those myths that hold up that worldview, then people say, well, then if this is true, then where do I go from here? And that's where we need to be in place, is to be able to say, this is where we go from here. So a lot of opportunities ahead. I wish things were changing faster, but I guess we do what we can.
Thank you. Before we take Joanna's question, Ax, Elio, or Ellie, did you want to respond to that question at all? No? Okay, excellent. Joanna.
Hi, thank you very much. Yeah, so my question's for anyone on the panel, really. I have two, though the second one is super short. So the first one, as someone who's relatively new to thinking about this area of theology, I'm already struck by the difficulty of who counts as Indigenous. So there are some fairly clear-cut cases, right? Native American peoples and tribes being a particularly, seemingly to me, fairly clear-cut case. But I'm wondering whether Scottish people count as Indigenous. The white Scottish people, Celts, for example, and whether Celtic Christianity counts as an Indigenous Christianity. And similarly, and in part because they're Indigenous to Scotland, in a sense, they've been there for thousands of years, but they are also colonizers of other parts of the world, which makes them, I think, a difficult case. Similarly, we might think of the Maori people of New Zealand as, on the face of it, a clear-cut group of Indigenous peoples, but they are also colonizers of New Zealand from Polynesia. There were people living on New Zealand before the Maori arrived. And so it's, I like, how do we make that kind of call? What is it to do with the beliefs that are being held? Is it to do with one's relationship to the land? Is it to do with just how long you've been there? And the reason I really want to ask this question is not just because I want to be able to put labels on people, but because I do think there's something powerful in the call to become Indigenous. So I'm not an Indigenous person, really by any measure, but I feel that there's an important sense to which there's a call to become an Indigenous person. But depending on how we're defining who counts as Indigenous will depend on what it means to become Indigenous for those of us who were not born Indigenous. I hope I'm making sense in this question. But that already strikes me as very important and very difficult. And as I say, as I'm new to this area, I would love some guidelines about how to think about that. Which leads into my very, very quick second question, which is there anything, what's my essential reading? Can you give me some essential reading as I continue to think around Indigenous theology?
Thanks, Jana. Who'd like to respond to that question? Questions, rather. Elia.
Yeah. Yeah. As far as I can understand, the indigenous, those who, in my understanding, indigenous people is those who keep their indigenous traditions and practice it in their daily life. And whether they have become Christians or Muslims, I talk this from my context in Indonesia. They can be Muslim, they can be Christian, but they can hold the same values, can stand on the same ground. They are in the same boat, which is indigenous values that they hold and practice in their daily life. Even this is, I just want to add this more complexity in this issue. Like in my context, people in Savo Island, where my wife comes from, the Christians there, every day they will say that indigenous people are bad and so on and so on. It's Christians, it's very Western Christians. But they won't start planting, put the seeds on the land before the indigenous chief says so. So the indigenous people, they know how to, they can read the moon, the stars, and they can decide today you have to plant because the rain will come. And then if you don't do this, or you do it earlier, then it will not work for you. So these Christian people, they every day they say these people is bad. They have a very primitive way of life, but even in that case, they still listen to these people. They still listen to indigenous chief because Christianity never tell them how to live in that island. Only these indigenous people who interact with the environment, as Dr. Woodley says in his book. So I don't know, in that case, can these people, this Western Christianity, every day marginalize the indigenous people, but they still do the practice of the indigenous people? Can they be categorized as indigenous as well, or they just in some way indigenous, but in other ways, in most ways, they don't. They are not indigenous. Yeah.
Thank you, Elia. Dr. Woodley, Axe, Ellie, did you want to respond further, or please?
Yeah, I like that. That example's great. Sometimes we have more influence than we realize. But yeah, I think we were all born to be indigenous. I think that's our role as human beings, to be connected to the land and a relationship to the land and working with the land, not using the land. Of course, time and circumstance and location all can change that, right? So, but I like to make the distinction between indigenous with a capital I and indigenous with a small I. So indigenous with a capital I means your people have been living there before colonization and haven't been consumed by colonization, and they're still primarily living with the land. A small I indigenous means, I think, people, because I think we were all indigenous from somewhere at some point, right? In our DNA, we have that memory, hopefully. And it's often we hear our ancestors, or we hear the land calling us back, or we hear Creator, or however you want to think about it. But calling us back to understand what this is all about, to be a part of the land, to be a relative with the community of creation. And with a small I, we can all become more indigenous and faithful to our indigenous roots. And so I invite all the people I speak to become small I indigenous, even if they, 2,000 years have passed since they were capital I indigenous. We all need to do that. That's our human responsibility, is to quote unquote tend the garden, take care of the community of creation. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Ellie or Ax, did you want to come in, or should I take Akim's question?
I also want my essential reading, by the way.
Oh, yes, sorry. Perhaps we can use the chat to put in some essential
Oh yeah, if
reading links.
anyone from everyone who's here wants to give me essential reading, that would be great. Beyond, obviously, the book that we're discussing.
Okay, one of the things I can do then is I can curate and then send it out to everyone who attended too, if you want. All right, excellent. Akim, please.
Thank you so much. That was a really wonderful discussion. My question really, and it's something I've been kind of wrestling with for a while. I'm talking primarily from thinking about African contextual theology, but primarily even Christology. And I've been kind of looking through what's been written the last 50 years on African contextual Christology, African Christology. And I don't know how to formulate this, but essentially what I find is that though they're reclaiming a lot of indigenous thoughts in how to think about Christology, I still find that in a sense, the idea of orthodoxy is still the parameters in which they're dancing with or dancing in. And anything that kind of sways beyond that, even in thinking about an African Christ, is seen as syncretistic. It's seen as, it's almost, there's still this fear. So for me, I think my question really is, how do you understand decolonization in that context? And are you, and how do you kind of navigate the argument of syncretism?
Yeah. I can answer that, Akim, for a bit. Nice to see you again there, Akim. This is an interesting question, but I think we've spoken about this before in terms of orthodoxy. And one of the biggest problems is, if you look in a South African context, you have Xhosas who mainly were colonized by Protestants. So your Scottish, your Church of Scotland, Free Church of Scotland, Anglican Methodists, but the Zulus, Catholicism. And so they have a much more, Protestants would call a syncretic way of viewing Christ. They pray through saints because of that relationship, and they still do ancestral veneration. So you're right, you're very right. All African Christologies are bound to the framework of their church tradition, and that's a reality there. But what I found in my research is that, for example, Mlele, in his time in the 1800s, he calls Jesus Day. So he says that Ndalipu, which is the god he created, the god of the blacks, he had a son with the earth, right? And the sun was day. So it's a very indigenous way of theologizing. But his contemporary, which I didn't mention in my presentation, Tsikana, he adopts the sort of, I would say, Protestant Western missionary perspective of saying that God is Tiko and his son, and it's his son, which is Jesus. But already in those traditions, you can actually see like how, particularly Black nationalists in South Africa, they draw from Nlele's sort of tradition, even Black consciousness. You sort of see how its radical wing can find its root with Nlele's sort of ideology, whereas those of more, not so radical, but radical, not in the, we want the land now radical. So it's a different they would draw more from Tsikana, Reverend Tiasoga, and so on and so forth. So I think what you would have to do there to maybe help yourself. I actually dropped a book. There's a new book from a guy who actually compares Jesus' ancestor with looking at Athanasius and who's the other early Christian fathers, looking at those Christological debates and comparing the sort of the Jesus ancestor ideology or Christology in relation to that. And I think I haven't read it yet, but it's something that's on my list. And there's two new ones actually have just come out. And I think they will put like what we've seen, Bidiako, Charles Nyamiti, and John Beatty, what they've tried to do with Christology. I think they are taking it in a different direction. So I think I'll lead you to that and see where that's going. But I would say also try to look at the historicity of these views. Like what can you find from the early indigenous preachers? What were they saying? Well, how were they reinscribing and creating theology? And then see the sort of content, because it does change, it evolves. I mean, yes, people can be drawing from Lele's philosophy, but it's completely different. By the time it got to Steve Biko in the 1970s, it had nothing to do with Christ. It had everything to do with you're Black and beautiful, and that our Blackness is not something to be ashamed of, right? It wasn't really a Christology, but it was, you can sort of see the connection there of this emphasis of an ideology that reaffirms our social and personal situation. So I hope that helps in some way.
Great, thank you. Anyone else from the panel would like to come in?
Oh, one more thing, I almost forgot. It just came now. And also, like, you also see in South Africa, and sorry, I'm talking a lot about South Africa, but it's my context. Jesus as liberator. So the Christological image of Jesus liberator comes from a reinterpretation of the Exodus narrative, which is quite famous in Black theology, as you know. And again, it's Christology, I would say, in a African context, addresses the actual personal and social political needs that people have. And even Lele, even though like it didn't work out, but he's trying to address the needs of the people. And that in itself is what we do with indigenous theology, right? There needs to be the land. If the land has a drought, we need to understand why. We need to do something to fix that. It's a holistic relationship. It's not just capitalistic, me, prosperity now and big house. No, it's connected to the environment. So that's also something to consider. It's not just orthodoxy. It could also be social and personal situations that are influencing those ideas. Yeah, great.
Yeah, let me just quickly comment. Yeah, I agree with Ax, and it's I had a very interesting encounter with this was in 2021 when I was first year PhD student, and there was a conference going on in Cambridge, and so I went and presented my paper, which is about pneumatology, understanding the work and person of the Holy Spirit, but from the Naga perspective, and how to Naga people understand Holy Spirit. And most of the times, at least in the research so far, what I found is that Holy Spirit has also been juxtapositioned, like it's juxtaposed a lot of times with spirits, because the spirit consciousness is so strong, coming from a tribal context like mine. And it's something that you cannot cancel, because it's really there, it's existing. And one of the questions that I got, actually the first question was, is not this kind of Christianity, is it not syncretistic? That was the first question I got, and I was not surprised at all. It definitely made me think of how Christianity has been bound within very, very strict frameworks. And so I think what indigenous theology and culture, what indigenous culture is doing, and our place, I guess, to a large extent, can also be dismantling some of these things that already that is just too dominant. There is no place for our cultural thinking. I can think of from my context, the supreme being, before Christianity, one of the tribes called the supreme being as Lijaba, which means the soil, emerging from the soil. So the creator was emerging from the soil. It literally means from the soil. And so that kind of readings have been helpful for me as well, in my research as well. And definitely I know that I have lots more to think about. But one of the things that I keep on reminding myself is that surely the Holy Spirit was not, it is not the case that surely the Holy Spirit came only with Western missionaries, right? The Holy Spirit was at work before the Western missionaries came. And those are the things that I guess makes me think beyond categorizations and certain boundaries that we find so dominant around us. Thanks.
Yeah, I just wanted to address Akim's question. But before I do, just a very side note for Elia. Back in the 1990s, we had a Baptist from Nagaland come stay with us. His name was Imotinjim Ayer. And I don't know if he brought anything back, but he found so many similarities between the Plains Indian cultures and Nagaland. It was just, and we talked about those for a long time. So just wanted to say that this conversation's been going on for a while. But, and Akim, so it takes a lot of hubris for any theologian or theological school to presume that their understanding is not syncretistic. I mean, Western theology has syncretism in every corner, right? And so it reminds me of when I would go to speak to churches, and one of the first questions they would always ask, because we started something back in the late 80s, early 90s, and it was called later, because people always call movements something, the Native American Cultural Contextual Movement, right? And so this was a controversy to the white churches. They were like, how far are they going to go? So the first question was, how far can you, what we want to know is how far are you going to take this thing, right? And my answer was always the same. It's not up to you to decide how far. It's up to the local people. And if they allow you to have input, then you're a minor player. But this is the role of the indigenous community, not your role. So, because we all have syncretism, and it doesn't, I think almost, I can't speak for every religion, every theology, but, I'm sure in most of them we can find syncretistic understandings. And I'm not afraid of syncretism. I remember I had a student living in South Africa, and I made him, part of his assignment was to go visit the African Traditional Church, because because he had all these ideas, right? And all these things he was afraid of. And he came back and he was like, oh my gosh, they were so nice. That's the first thing he said. And so I think a lot of times this fear of syncretism is what keeps us apart and from understanding one another, and understanding, again, back to what is the purpose of the story? The purpose of the story is what's the truth in the story, not is the story the truth. And yeah, so I think that the thing that I'm more afraid of than syncretism is synchronism, where everybody has to be the same. All of our theologies have to be the same, So yeah, I'm not worried about syncretism.
Excellent. Who's afraid of syncretism? Any other questions or comments or points of dialogue anyone would like to raise at all? We have a few more minutes here.
I just wanted to say thanks to all the feedback. But honestly, on the last comment you said, Prof, I was literally like, I was about to go to church and start saying hallelujah. That was just, I'm going to have to write that down. Like, whoa, that was serious. That's serious. No, yeah, no. I'm just excited. So let me control myself and let other people speak. But yeah, no, thank you so much.
Fabulous. Thanks, Hakeem. Any points of dialogue or questions or anything at all, please, from anyone we haven't heard yet? The floor is open. It belongs to everyone. So I'm just the monkey with the, you know. Or anything further from those of us on the those of you on the panel that you'd like to take forward that you had not taken forward before or raised before at all. Katrina, you've unmuted yourself. Did you want to come in?
I've been unmuted all the time.
Sorry.
No, I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to the discussion. There was somebody who mentioned genetic remembering. I think where I lived in Scotland for 6 months and I felt I'd come home. I've got Scottish ancestry about 3-4 generations back. But I felt I'd come home. And I knew when we were driving somewhere or going somewhere, I sort of there was a familiarity about it. And yeah, that was just my experience of.
Thank you, Katrina. Any responses from the panel? If not, there's another question that's come up as well. Sunil, please.
Hi, thanks a lot. It's been absolutely sparkling in lots of different ways. My question is around the whole idea of being a migrant and what that means for indigeneity. I suppose my experience is I was born here but grew up in India and then have moved back here. I have a multicultural family, and so it's trying to work out what that multiple belonging means, because when it comes to the land, I suppose there is a certain rootedness in one very particular sense. I feel that belonging to multiple lands seems quite hard. So I was wondering whether there were any comments on that notion of being a migrant, of what that means for belonging and what that means for connection to land.
So I don't want to hog the mic. I'll just be real quick. When we lost everything in Kentucky, which is part of that was my tribal people's land, I realized that I would probably never live there again. And that was sad for me because there was a sense of connectedness that I had that I don't feel here in Oregon. But I did go to the indigenous people here, to their traditional keepers of the culture, and asked for permission to practice my own ceremonies and my own teachings and things here, and what I could do to honor them while I'm using their land and connecting with their land, and they gave me some instructions, and they gave me permission to. And we just had yesterday a blessing of the seed ceremony, which is our Katua ceremony, not of the land here. It's not the same, but it is land, and I do have a connection to it, and I have to honor their connection by understanding more about who they are, their stories, their connections, attending their events, supporting them in their political causes, things like this. But I also have my own connections. I wouldn't be honest if I said this feels the same as when I'm in my home territory. But circumstances are such that that's probably never going to happen again. So I have to become indigenous to this land with a small I.
Elia or Ax, do you want to also respond? Elia, please.
Yeah, that's interesting. Story, Sunil. I think it depends on how the indigenous community where you come from perceives somebody who go abroad, go outside, and then coming back. I think how they perceive, how they, what's the understanding of that, and their attitude toward it. In my experience, and my mother comes from an island, different island from my father. I grew up in different island. So, but once I come back to my father's island, as the people say, the elders say, the land's child is coming home. So it's always like something, but it's their worldview, it's their practice. You've never been like separated from the land. You just go outside. One day you will come back. So I think it depends on how the indigenous community understand that.
Yeah, even so among Xhosas, it's very, our history is quite complicated because actually we are all southeastern Bantus. So Zulus and Ndebeles and Bedis, we're all sort of the same language group. So we were minor chiefdoms, and we've moved around, mixed with the Khoi and the San, who are the capital I indigenous people of South Africa. And yeah, like moving, there is a strong connection with your homeland. You have to recite, even if I'm here in the UK, if I meet another Xhosa here in the UK, you will ask, who are you? And that's not just Axolile Qina, it's reciting of clan names and your previous sort of your homeland where you come from. So that doesn't change, even though I grew up in Joburg. Home is still in the Transkei where the ancestors rest, because great-great-grandfather stood there. And so there's that sort of fluidity. So yeah, I think it does really come back to how your community and your context sort of take one who leaves and the relationship thereof. But like my aunt in Canada, they call us the Mavericks because we're too far. It's like, we have to go on 2 planes to come see you. We just, so we're the Mavericks. So you're in good company.
It's good to be in the room with Mavericks. I think we can take one final quick question or comment or point of dialogue. That's all. If anyone has something they'd like to say.
I would like to say thank you very much. It's been very interesting. The speakers and the dialogue that's went on. It was just I'm so glad that I came and joined you on Zoom. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Dorothy. A pleasure to have you with us, and a pleasure to have all of you. And it's been such a fantastic conversation. And I'm so full. Yes, sorry, Randy.
Yeah, I just didn't know if I was going to get an opportunity to say a final word or not.
Of course.
So
Yeah.
I let it in. Forgive me. Yeah, I just want to say that this has been a wonderful experience. If I can emphasize anything, and it's what the comment just reminded me of, Dorothy's comment, was that it's about pedagogy, or sometimes we like to say anthropogy, and process. we move at the speed of the people, right? So when we get too far ahead, sometimes we need people to pull us back. When we get too far behind, we need people to push us forward. And there's a saying that goes here. Someone said that we move at the speed of trust, but I like it better to say we move at the speed of courage. And so be courageous. Be courageous in your studies, be courageous in what you do with them, and be courageous in your imagination as to how you're going to encapsulate this so that people, not PhDs, but other people can move with you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Woodley. In fact, I was just about to hand over to you for some final words. And you've given us such beautiful final words to be courageous. And so I feel like I've been hogging the mic a lot myself. So I'm going to hand over to Theo to close us off. Thank you, Theo.
Sure. Well, thank you. Thanks, Anu. Thank you so much to everybody. This has been such an exhilarating conversation, and the energy has been really inspiring. So I'm really glad to have been a part of this. I just wanted to say a few thank yous to everyone who has been working behind the scenes. Thank you, Anu. Thank you for Andrew and folks at SST for putting this together. And of course, our big respect and gratitude to Dr. Woodley for speaking to us today and for joining the conversation. Thank you to Elia, and X as well for your sharp reflections. Made the conversations much more richer and so much texture that you added to the conversation. So thank you so much for that. And I just want to say really quickly about the network, the RISC RISC network that we are part of, Researching Indigenous Studies and Christianity. It's a group of scholars that we are part of, PhDs and also PhD students who are working on Indigenous theology, biblical studies, Christian studies, all of that. And we are, first of all, a community of friends and acquaintances who decided to get together to have conversations, critical discussions, and kind of resource sharing. So we formed this network just almost a year ago. And this is a place where we have these kinds of conversations. Although I wish we could have like Dr. Woodley join us. I mean, make these rich conversations, but we have these kinds of questions and critical conversations as well. So the main reason for this shout out is if this is something that you are interested in, do get in touch with us. It will be lovely to expand our scope of the conversation and the scope of our discourse too. And so if that's of interest, do shoot us an email at risc.network@gmail.com. We do have a website as well, so I'll put that in the link too. But thank you so much to everybody who has joined. It's an overwhelming response that we got, and we're so humbled and we're so glad to have had this conversation. Thank you. Thank you. I think that's it for the Zoom call. Thank you so much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks a lot.
Bye. Thanks, everyone. Bye.